Hello Divination and welcome. In today's video, I'm going to be showing you how to apply colliding animations to design elements with Divi. This is the final result we're aiming to achieve. So without wasting a lot of time, let's dive in and let's get started. All right, so the first thing we're going to do is to create a brand new page. So I'm going to come over here to Pages, click on Add New. We're going to give our page a name. So I'm going to call this Colliding Animations. And then I'm going to go ahead and click on Use the Divi Builder. And we're going to build this from scratch. So I'm going to click here on Build from Scratch. So what we're going to do here is we are going to start with a speciality section. So I'm going to close this, click this plus button here and click on speciality. So the option we're going to go with is the second one here. So I'm going to go ahead and click it. I'm going to close this for now. And I'm going to delete my top section. So the next thing we need to do is to make this section full width. So I'm going to come over here, click this gear icon. And then I'm going to come over here to Design, Layout, Sizing, and then I'm going to make this section full width, choose yes, and then we're going to save. Over here, we need to add our rows. So I'm going to click here on this plus button to add our row, and we're going to add two equal columns. So I'm going to click here. I'm going to close this for now. Now let's head over to our row settings. So I'm going to click here on this gear icon to enter my row settings. So I'm going to click here, and then over here, the first thing I'm going to do is to set my gutter width. So I'm going to click here on Design, Sizing, and then I'm going to click on Use Custom Gutter Width, set that to yes, and then I'm going to set my gutter width to 1. Now, the reason why we're setting it to 1 is because we want to reduce the space between the two columns. Right, so now that we have that in place, we're going to head over to spacing, because here we need to add a top padding of 44 pixels, enter it here, and then for the bottom, we're going to set it to 0. So that's all we need to do for now. The next thing we need to do is to add a text module to column 1. So I'm going to save this, and then I'm going to click this plus button, search for my text module, and select it. So what we're going to do here is we're going to type some text. We're just going to call this amazing, and we're going to set this to heading 1. So what you need to do is to highlight it first, because by default, it's set to a paragraph. And then over here on the top, I'm going to click this drop down and set it to heading 1. Now let's head over here to our text settings. So I'm going to click here on Design, or the quickest way to do it as well is to just come over here and click this little brush tool. That will take you straight to the settings of your heading text. So the first thing we're going to do here is to set our font. So right now it's on default. We need a font called Monsterrat. So here it is. I'm going to select it. And for the font weight, we're going to set it to light. Click here on this drop down, select my light font weight. And then for the heading text size, we're going to set it to 4.4 VW. So while we're here, we might as well set the sizes for the tablet and the mobile devices. So I'm going to click here on this little icon. And for the tablet, we're going to set this to 8.2 VW. Paste it here. And we're going to do the same for the phone. Come over here. But this time, this needs to be set to 40 pixels. Great. So now that we have our text heading size, we're going to click here back on desktop. And then we're going to move on and add our line height. So our line height currently is set to 1 EM. We need to reduce this to 0.7 EM. So I'm going to enter that there. So that's all we need to do for now. Let's go ahead and save. The next thing we need to do now is to add a divider. So I'm going to click this plus button, search for my divider module, select it, and then make sure show divider is set to yes. And that's how we can see this line here. Now let's set the color for our divider. So I'm going to click here on Design, Color. And we're going to set this to black. Now let's head over here to the sizing, because we need to add a custom size. So by default, it's set to 100%. We need to set the width to 91%. So I'm going to enter it manually here. And you can see here that the line has reduced slightly. Now, the next thing we need to do is, as you can see, this line is way too close to the text. So in order for us to fix that, we can add a top margin. So I'm going to scroll down here, go to spacing, and add a top margin of 30 pixels. So now we have a bit of distance between the two. So the next thing we're going to do is to add an animation to this. So I'm going to click here on animation, and the animation style is going to be slide. So I'm going to select it, and the direction is going to be left. So I'm going to come over here. By default, it's set to center. So I'm going to click this drop down, choose left, and then we're going to save. Right, so moving on, let's add another heading. So what I'm going to do here is to click this plus button, and I'm just going to search for my text module here, select it. And this time I'm going to call this Features and Products. So I'm going to get rid of this. Right, so this also needs to be a heading. So I'm going to highlight the text, set this to heading 1. And I'm just going to make sure that this ampersand and products are on the same line. Right, so now that we have this in place, the next thing we need to do now is to customize the text. So we need to go to the heading text settings. on design, and then I'm just going to click this brush tool. So that will take us straight to our header text settings. Right, so while we're here, the font we're going to use is pretty much the same as we used here on this word amazing. So I'm going to click this drop down and it should be right here, so I don't have to search for it again. So I'm going to select my font, and then over here I'm going to choose my weight, and then this time it's going to be light. So moving on, let's add our color. So I'm going to click this eyedropper tool and paste my color in here. Now, if you want to use the same colors as I'm using throughout this tutorial, I will leave a link in the comments box, and you can go to the post and follow along with the same colors. So moving on, now that we've added our color, the next thing we need to do is to add our text size, our heading text size. So I'm going to add it here. This is going to be 3.8 VW. And then like we did before, we're going to add our tablet and smartphone sizes. Right, so I'm just going to hover over here and click on this little icon, click on tablet and add my value. And this time it's going to be 6.5 VW. Click on the phone, and here we need to set it to 40 pixels. So just make sure that you type it in. All right, great. So now that we have all that in place, the next thing to do is to add your line height. So I'm going to scroll down here and add my line height. Right, so as we did before, let's add our animation. So I'm going to scroll down here, click on animation, and again, it's going to be a slide, and the direction is left. So I'm going to scroll down here, click on this drop down, set it to left, and our animation delay is going to be 600. So I'm going to come over here, set this to 600, and our animation intensity needs to be set to 10%. Okay, so I'm pretty much happy with that. So I'm going to scroll down here as well. And now what I'm going to do is to just drag it to the right position. So I'm going to save this, and I'm going to just drag it over here to the second column. Now it's time to add our second row. So I'm going to click here on this plus button, and this time we need a single column. So I'm going to select this. I'm going to add my text. So I'm going to search for my text module here, add my text in there. And then I'm just going to save this for now. And then over here below the text, I'm going to add a button. So I'm going to select it. And the text for the button here, we're just going to call this learn more. So you can go ahead here and change the style of the button. So let me show you quickly how to do that. So I'm going to click here on design button. So in order for us to do those changes, you need to come over here to use custom styles for button. Set that to yes, add our color. In fact, our text color needs to be white. So I'm going to set this to white. And then I'm going to add my background color. So my background color here is just going to be, maybe let's go with this color here. Then if you scroll down, we have our border radius. So we can remove that completely. So I'm going to set that to 0. So it's a complete rectangle. And then I'm going to scroll down here and go to my font and make sure that this is all caps. And then I'm going to reduce the size a little bit because it's slightly too big. So I'm going to scroll down. I'm going to reduce the size here, maybe about 16 or even 17. Right, so that looks good. And I think I might make it even bold or semi-bold. That looks good. And then finally, I'm just going to match my font here. So I'm going to choose Montserrat. So that looks great. I'm going to save that. And then over here as well, I'm going to go in and change my font. Click here on design, text. And I'm going to change this to the font that I've been using. Right, so that looks great. So pretty much this is our final design. So let's move on and recreate example number 2, which has the colliding dividers. Right, so let's add our speciality section. So I'm going to come over here, click this plus button, choose speciality section, and then I'm going to choose this option here as we did before. Now let's go into the sizing. So I'm going to close this, and then I'm going to click on this gear icon here to go into my section settings. Click on design, sizing. We're going to make this full width. Now let's add our column structure. So I'm going to save this, and then over here, I'm going to click this plus button to add my columns. And this time we're going to go for a single column. So I'm going to select it. I'm going to close this for now. So let's go into our row settings and add our settings. So I'm going to click here on this row settings icon, click on design, and then we're going to go to spacing and add our top padding. So our top padding here is going to be 44 pixels and bottom is going to be 0. We're going to save this, and then we're going to come over here and add a text module. So I'm going to search for it, select it, and in here, we're just going to add text which says amazing features. We're going to highlight it and set this to heading 1. And then let's go ahead and add our styles. So I'm going to click here on the design tab, go into my heading text, change my font to Montserrat. Our font weight, we're going to set this to light. And let's go ahead and add our text size. So we want this nice and big. So we're going to change this to 70. And we might as well add the sizes for the tablet and the phone. So for the tablet, we're going to set this to 50. And for the phone, we're going to set this to 40. So it's always important to go in and specify the sizes you need for the different screen sizes. Right, so now that we've entered all that, now let's go to the line height and set it to 0.8 and then save. Next, we need to add another row. So I'm going to scroll down here, click this plus button, and this time we need 2 equal columns. I'm going to select that. I'm going to close this for now and go into the row settings. Right, so let's head over to the gutter width. So I'm going to click here on design, sizing, use gutter width. We're going to set this to yes, and then we're going to set this to 1. Now, as I mentioned before, the gutter width removes the space between the columns. All right, so now that we've set it to that, the next thing we need to do is to come over here to the width and set it to 53%. And for the tablet, we're going to set this to 100, and the phone needs to be 100 as well. All right, great. So now that we've entered that information, the next thing we need to do now is to add a top padding and a bottom padding. So I'm going to scroll down here to spacing, and let's add our padding. So our top padding here is going to be 50. And bottom is going to be 0, and then save. Right, so now we need to add our colliding dividers. So let's start by adding a divider here. So I'm going to click this plus button and search for my divider module and select it. So as you can see here, show divider is set to yes, and that's exactly what we need. Now moving on, let's add our color. So we're going to click here on the design tab, click on color, and I'm just going to click this eyedropper tool and paste my color in here. Now, as I mentioned before, if you want to use the exact same colors as I'm using throughout this tutorial, I will leave a link in the show notes below. Right, so this time we're going to add a style to our divider. So I'm going to click here on styles, and then I am going to change the style to double. So right now it's set to solid. Choose double. Now let's go to the sizing and add our divider weight. So right now it's set to 1. If we add 8 to this, you notice that my lines start appearing there. And that's exactly what we need. Now let's go to our animation. So I'm going to click here on the animation tab, and we are going to choose slide. But this time we are going to choose our direction, and our direction is going to be right. So I'm going to click here and choose right. So now it's going to move towards the right. So I'm going to save. This divider here is going to be similar to the one I'm going to add in the second column. So we might as well go ahead and clone it. So I'm going to click here on this clone icon and drag this over here to the right. So once it's there on the right, all you have to do now is to click here on this gear icon, choose design, animation, and this time we want this to animate from the left, like that. So it looks like those two lines are colliding. So let's go ahead and save. Now it's time to add another row. So I'm going to click here on this plus button, and this time it's going to be a single column. So all you have to do is to add your remaining modules. So I'm just going to add a text module here, search for it, click on text. And now my text has been applied. I'm going to save that. And if we need a button to that as well, I'm just going to copy the one that we have here. So I'm just going to hit Command C and Command V to paste. Now, if you're on a PC, it's Control C to copy, Control V to paste. Great. So pretty much that's our design for our colliding dividers. Now it's time to recreate the colliding grid. So this one is a bit more challenging, but let's see how we get on. So first of all, we're going to start by adding a new section, but this time it's not going to be the specialty section. So I'm just going to come over here, click this plus button and add a regular section. I'm going to close this for now and go into the section settings. So the first thing I'm going to do is to add a top padding of 300 and bottom of 200. So to do that, we can either do a quick search here. In fact, this is a quick way of working on this. Let's just search for our padding. And as you can see, it's narrowed down all our information here. So I'm going to add 300 to the top and 200 to the bottom. Okay, so now we're going to add our row. So I'm going to save this, and then I'm going to scroll down here, click this plus button, and our column structure is going to be just one single column. So I'm going to select that, and we're going to add an image module to the column. So I'm going to search for my image module, select it. So we need to add our image here. So I'm going to click anywhere on the image, upload files, select files, and I'm going to go to my downloads folder and choose my image. So the image I'm using here is on the post, which I'll link to in the show notes below. So go ahead and download it from there. So next I'm going to click upload an image. So now my image has been added. So right now we can't see it because it's a PNG image. Right. So the next thing I want to do is to come over here to the background and add a gradient. So I'm going to click here on my gradient tab, click this plus button, and we're going to add our first color. I'm going to paste it in here, add my second color, paste it in place. Right, so the next we need to change our image alignment. So I'm going to click here on design alignment and we're going to make sure that it's centered. Next, we're going to click here on sizing and make sure we click on force full width. And then we're going to come over here to spacing and add a left and a right margin of 200. So I'm going to add my 200 here and just activate my chain. Next, I'm going to come over here to animation, and this time our animation style is going to be zoom, and our direction is going to be center, and we're going to add 3000 here on the animation duration. And for the animation intensity, we're going to change this to 100%, and then we're going to save. Now it's time to add our second row. So I'm going to click here on this plus button, and this time we're going to choose 3 equal columns. I'm going to select that. I'm going to close this for now because we're going to go in the row settings and make some changes. So I'm going to click here on row settings, and then we're going to make sure that use custom width is set to yes. So I'm going to click here on design, sizing, yes to use custom width, and we're going to set our custom width to 944 pixels. So make sure your unit here is set to pixels. And for use custom gutter width, we're going to set this to yes, and I'm going to set it to 1. And again, I don't want any spaces between my columns. So moving on, now that we've set all that up, we're going to add a blurb module. So I'm going to first of all save here and then click this plus button and search for my blurb. So I'm just going to start typing the first few letters here. Okay, I'm going to select it. Right, so for the title here, I'm just going to add some dummy text. So I'm just going to go in and paste this. Now it's time to choose our icon. So I'm going to come over here to image and icon, change this to use icon, and I'm going to choose my first icon here, and I'm going to go with this little triangle facing up. Click here on background, and we're going to add a background color. So our color here is going to be an RGBA value, which means it's going to have some transparency. So I'm going to click the slider down here and paste my color between the brackets. And again, as I mentioned before, the color is going to be in the post, which I'll link to in the show notes below. Right, so before we continue, what we need to do here is to come back to text and get rid of this paragraph text. So I'm just going to delete that. Now let's go ahead and set our icon settings. So I'm just going to click here on this brush tool. So first of all, we're going to add the color of our icon. So right now it's dark gray. Ideally, this needs to be set to black. Icon placement, it needs to be set to the top, and use icon font size. Now this is used to set the size for the icon. So I'm going to click here and reduce the size to about 73. Now let's go to our title text settings. Right, so I'm going to click here on this little brush tool one more time, and we are going to change our font here to Open Sans. So I'm going to search for it. I'm going to select Open Sans. It's going to be semi-bold, text alignment centered, and our size here is going to be 15. Letter spacing is going to be -1, and our line height is going to be 1.8. Right, so next we're going to come over here to sizing because we need to customize our width. So our content width is currently at 100%. We're going to set this to 183 pixels. Now let's head over here to spacing and add some top and bottom padding. So I'm going to set this to 50 just to give this a bit of breathing space. Now it's time to add our box shadow. So I'm going to click here on box shadow. The option I'm going to go with is this one right here. So I'm going to select it. So the blur shadow strength, we're going to set this to 80 pixels. And let's add our color. So I'm going to click here on this eyedropper tool. And in fact, our color is right. So we're just going to leave that as it is. Right. So what we're going to do now is to add our transitions, and our transitions can be found by coming over here to the advanced tab, clicking on transitions, and we're going to set this to 600. So what you want to do next, because this is what we need, you're going to clone this 8 times. So I'm just going to save this for now and go ahead and clone a few times, and then you can just go ahead and clone this 8 times. So I'm going to drag this into position just like that. So now that we have all our blurbs, the next thing we need to do is to go in and make some modifications to each and one of these. So I'm going to start here with the first one. So I'm going to click here on my blurb module settings, and then I'm going to go to the top margin. So I'm going to click here and go to spacing, and for the top margin, we're going to set this to -340. And then for the tablets, we're going to set this to 0, and we're going to do the same for the phone, set that to 0. All right, so now that we've set that, so the next thing we want to do here is to add our hover settings. So I'm going to click here on this little arrow, click on the hover tab, and we're going to set our value here, which is going to be -380. For the bottom margin, we're going to set this to 40. And for our left margin, this is going to be -40. And the right margin is going to be 40. Now let's add some rounded corners. So I'm going to click here on border, break this chain, and I'm going to add 30 pixels to the top. And now you can see we have a nice rounded corner there at the top. Right, so the next stage now is to add our animation. So I'm going to scroll down here, click on animation, and the animation style is going to be slide. So I'm going to select it. The direction needs to be set to left. So I'm going to click here on left, and animation delay is going to be 200. So that's all we need to do for now. Let's go ahead and save. So the next stage now is to go to the blurb number 2. So I'm going to click here. And the first thing we're going to do here is to change the background color. So I'm going to click here and add my color. Again, it's going to be an RGBA value. So my values are going to be between the brackets. Now let's head over here to spacing. So I'm going to click here on design, spacing. And here we need to add a top margin of -340. And then I'm going to enter the values for the tablet and the phone, which are 0 and 0. Now it's time to go into the hover. So I'm going to click here on this little arrow, click on the hover tab. And here we're going to set it to -380. And the bottom margin is going to be set to 40. And we're going to go to the animation and we're going to set this to slide. But this time it's going to be slide left. And the animation delay is going to be 400. And then save. So for this third one here, what you need to do is to add the rounded corner on the right side. So I'm going to come over here to border, break this chain, and add 30 pixels here. So now you can see that our rounded corner is also on the right side. Now let's head over here to our animation. And for our animation, we're going to set this to, the delay to 600 and then save. Next, we're going to come over here to the fourth one. So you just need to continue going into these modules and adding all your settings. So I'm going to start off here with the background, add my background color, paste it in here. Next, we're going to go to our margin. So I'm going to click here on design, spacing. And over here, we need to add a left margin on the hover. So I'm going to click here on this little icon. And for the left, we're going to set this to -40 and 40 to the right. Click on animation. And our animation style this time is going to be fade. So I'm going to choose the second option here. And the delay is going to be 800 and then save. Next, I'm going to come over here to the fifth one. So I'm going to click here on the settings. So all we need to do here is to add our animation style. So I'm going to click here on design, animation. We're going to set this to fade as well. But the duration needs to be 1000 and then save. Moving on to the sixth one. So I'm going to click here on this gear icon. And what we're going to do here as well is to add our background color. So I'm going to click here on background, click on this background area, paste my color in here between the brackets. Right, next we're going to come over here to design, spacing, and we're going to come over here to the hover spacing. So we're going to click here on this little icon, click on hover and set our left margin to 40 and right to -40. Click on animation, set it to fade, and 1200 on the delay. Right, so we're getting close now. I'm going to save this. Now it's time to go to number 7. So I'm going to click here on my module settings. So we're going to start with the margins as well as we did before. So I'm going to click here on spacing and I'm going to add my hover spacing by clicking this arrow, click the hover tab, and we're going to set this top margin to 40, left to -40, and our right margin needs to be set to 40. Right, so to match our design here, we also need to add our rounded corners because we have them here on the top left and the top right. So now we need it on the bottom left. So let's click here on border, break the chain and set it to bottom left. So this again is going to be 30 pixels. So now we have consistency on our rounded corners. Right, so the next thing we need to do here is to come over to animation and make sure we choose slide, and we're going to slide to the right. So I'm going to click here on direction, set it to right, and then our animation delay is going to be 1400. So that's all we need to do. I'm going to save this. I'm going to move on to the next one. So I'm going to click on the gear icon here to go into the settings. Start with the background, add our background color. We're going to go to the hover spacing. So I'm going to click on spacing, click this little icon. And for our top margin, we're going to set this to 40. So make sure the hover tab is selected. And then we're going to come over here to animation. And the style is going to be slide. Direction is going to be right. And our animation delay is going to be 1600. Right. So finally, it's time now to change our settings on number 9. So I'm going to click here to go into my settings. So my top margin is going to start at 40. So I'm going to click here on design, spacing. We're going to go into the hover tab. And then for the top here, we're going to set it to 40. And for the left, it's going to be 40 as well. And for the right margin, we're going to set this to -40. So we're going to add our rounded corner here. So I'm going to click on border, break the chain, set my 30 pixels here. Now it's time to go into the animation. So I'm going to set this to slide. I'm going to slide right. So I'm going to scroll down here, make sure I choose right. And then our animation delay is going to be 1800. Right, so the next thing we need to do now is we want all these squares to be pretty much in the middle of this shape. So what we need to do is to come over here to the image settings, click on design, and we are going to add a negative margin here. So we're going to add -520. In fact, this needs to be applied to the bottom. Okay, so now you can see our shape is right there in the middle. Okay, so this finalizes our design. So let's take a look and see if everything is working okay. So I'm going to save this and exit the Visual Builder. So you can see here our first animation coming to life. And then if I scroll down here, you can see the second animation. And then over here, we have this massive animation here coming to life as well. So check this out. If you start mousing over here, you can see all our shapes breaking apart. And it also works here on the bottom. So there you have it. Thank you all for watching. If you like this video, please give me a thumbs up and do follow us on our social media platforms. By doing so, you'll be notified every time we release new tutorials. Until next time, thanks for watching and I'll see you in the next video.